Oh, Ovigwe Eguegu is a geopolitics and policy analyst at Development Reimagined, an African international affairs consultancy. He joins us now via Zoom from Abuja, Nigeria, for more on this story. Thanks so much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so how important is this visit? I mean, we've got a full attention that's been placed on Ukraine and Russia and what's happening in Western Europe. And for him to take time out to go all the way to South Korea suggests that this is a critically important mission.
Yes, it is, because for the past few months now, all attention and all eyes have been on Ukraine and Europe, like you rightly mentioned. And of course, what that means for the US's global alliance network, it's this sort of concern that the US might be distracted from the Asia Pacific and Asia more broadly. So with this trip is meant to send a very strong message both to US allies and partners in the region, as well as their declared foes. That the US, of course, has the capacity and capability to focus on two fronts. So both in Europe and at the same time have a robust policy, with its Asian partners and the Asian Pacific. And of course, what I think, given the geopolitical tensions in the world right now, all concerns around supply chains, and insecurity. You would also see that this trip would be an avenue for Biden to reassure U.S. alliance system in Asia Pacific, particularly the trilateral partnership between Japan, the United States, and South Korea. So they need to make Biden rather needs to make this initiative because partners all over the world are beginning to question whether the U.S., of course, prioritizes, their own concern amid, the war in Ukraine. So it's very interesting to see the discussions that will unfold. But what we're hearing from the White House it gives it indication that this is going to be both a military security and also economic, engagement during his tour.
All right. What are the big issues in the Southeast Asian Pacific at this time?
Well, I would say North Korea, for starters, is one, because we haven't seen a nuclear missile test in many years. I think the last time will be 2017. So if they end up doing that while Biden is still in the region, of course, that would be a very, very strong statement that signal from Pyongyang that they take their security and their defense very seriously, because you would know that for many years North Korea has used its nuclear program as a bargain to coerce the West into making concessions on sanctions and even just broader engagement with the world in general. So that, of course, is a major flashpoint, a major issue, North Korea. And then, of course, there's Taiwan. The Taiwan issue is a hot button issue for China, for the United States, because in recent years we've seen the U.S. move away from the one China policy, whereby it limits and even not have any form of diplomatic engagement with the Taiwan island. But if you notice what has been happening since the Trump administration, every so often we see reports and even visits from senior U.S. government officials. Very recently, we saw senators and congressmen visit, Taiwan, and that, of course, draws ire from Beijing, because it doesn't, recognize Taiwan's self-claimed sovereignty, and even the U.S. in its own, policy sticks, as affirmed the one China, principle. So that deviation, of course, shows there's a lot of concern, and the Taiwan issue is particularly sensitive given the broader geopolitical context with regards to Ukraine, because many analysts are drawing that connection between Russia-Ukraine issue and China-Taiwan issue. But although they might have their differences, but the main thing for that is what can the U.S. do to guarantee Taiwan's security, and even with the U.S. even take any efforts to guarantee Taiwan's security. So these basically are like the two main hot button military issues, about an issue about the Coral Islands and also, other economic issues. But I think the economic side of it is quite going to be very interesting because of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was launched last October, but we're still yet to see a lot of details on how the US wants to move forward with that.
Beijing definitely not happy with this trip, accusing Washington of traveling to the region just to sow discord. Apart from Taiwan, what other concerns might China have in the region for them to say that Biden's trip is about sowing discord?
Well, if you follow last week's Asian summit, you would see that the messaging and the wording from Biden's speech, and even just when he landed in South Korea, really follows that confrontation and block mentality. So where you are trying to divide the region into, or countries into, those who are for the United States and those who are against the United States. And that is a major issue, in the sense that we of course would not like to see another major conflict in the world. Just looking at what the world is suffering now, it's a lot, and then but at the same time, if we also look at the way the Biden strategy is evolving in Asia, it's a lot of diplomacy, a lot of bluster. But rather than the military commitment like Quad, which is the grouping between the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, there's also the AUKUS, partnership, the US, Australia, and then the UK. Now, these two military groupings are actually very, 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 very important, because at the very core of their establishment and their formation, it's about containment of China. So Beijing, on its own end, sees these two military formations as a real threat to its own national security and even global ambitions. So if you add that to even the economic competition and rivalry between both sides, which this trip is going to also really help the Biden administration push, because like I mentioned, if that Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was launched last year, the US is making it clear that the economic initiative it's not divorced from its military ambitions in the region. So tying both together, I mean, that could really be a formidable coalition, a formidable policy for US-China containment.
Sometimes politicians are prone to hyperbole and using large language, but President Biden says that so much of the future of the world is going to be written here in the Indo-Pacific in the next several decades. He says we're standing at an inflection point in history where the decisions we make today will have far-reaching impact in the world that we're leaving for our children. Is this hyperbole, or is it genuinely a moment in time in history where, for sure, the future of the world is being determined?
No, it's not hyperbole at all, because when you look at the Indo-Pacific as a whole, not just Asia, Southeast Asia, you have two of the largest countries, India, China, two of the major superpowers. You have the Chinese economy still growing, still very strong, military power increasing, at an astronomical pace, and then India just next in line, and the combined GDP, the combined economic power, the population, and also even if you look of both countries, is staggering. And then if you look at even the neighboring countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, these are in their own rights very important countries in the global system, whether it's the global supply chain or even in finance and in global security. So when you look at just the shared dynamic in the region, that is really what that is where most of the growth in the world is going to take place in the next few decades. That is where you have majority of the world's population. That is also where you have the most heated, great power competition. I mean, the Indo-Pacific is considered to be ground zero when it comes to, U.S.-China rivalry or great power conflict. What is happening in Ukraine is almost like, a preview of what the Indo-Pacific can actually be. So it's not hyperbole at all. But one of the things we have to understand is the way both countries are approaching the Indo-Pacific age, as it's been described, that both countries being China and the United States, is very different. So on one hand, you have Beijing always pushing forward this view of indivisible security, no country's security should be at the expense of another country's security, and having to try to build more of a consensus approach towards even the differences, because of course there are real and very clear differences between China and its neighbors. Good example is the maritime boundary conflict in the South China Sea. Now you compare that to the United States, where you see a lot of what we like to call block formation, right? So you look at the region, you select a few countries, and you create a partnership, and then that partnership is meant to serve as a tool to compete with your rival. So that bifurcation of the Indo-Pacific or Asia, if you would, it's very problematic, because you are really setting the tone for conflict, right? So now but again, many of these countries in Asia, they're actually very, very aware of what's happening. I mean, just look at what was done in the White House when the Asian leaders attended the Asian summit in Washington. We saw $150 million, for instance, that the United States announced will go into new project for climate, maritime and public health infrastructure. Now, if you're an Asian leader and you contrast that to the $40 billion that the United States as Congress just approved for Ukraine, of course, you begin to realize that, maybe, you just want to be used as a tool to counter China, not necessarily the real commitment to your own development, particularly countries, like Malaysia, Philippines, that are in dire need of investment and lots of finance into their economies. So that is why the Indo-Pacific is very important. But like I said, in terms of security, I think because of the maturity of the states, it's very unlikely that we might see a full-blown crisis at some point. However, the economics of it is moving at a really fast pace, because like I was mentioning earlier, the Indo-Pacific economic framework is going to be very, very important. If the United States can get Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Singapore signed on to that deal, and possibly India, although the Indians are not really enthusiastic at the moment, what they can do with that is to really set a framework to promote a common economic strategy that might be very, very very, very important in containing China. Because if you listen to what Biden is saying about we do not want authoritarian regimes and all of that, it's invariably talking to China. So it is really the economics that will determine the outlook more than the military confrontations.
Ovigwe, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Your insights, always greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time. All right, that's Ovigwe Eguegu, who's a geopolitics and policy analyst at the Development Reimagined, an African international affairs consultancy. And he was talking to us about Joe Biden, President of America's visit to Southeast Asia.